The French Revolution was undeniably a momentous event. It began in 1789 and did not end until 1794 for some, when a new regime and the forces of conservatism tried to contain and domesticated it. Now, if you remember, it began with the deputies of the Estates General who contested the legitimacy of the authority of the French absolutist king, Louis XIV. And at first, France became a constitutional monarchy. After a series of development, things took a different turn. In 1791, Jews, Protestants, and some free people of color were granted full political and civil rights. And at the same time, a revolution erupted in Saint-Domingue. A year later, in 1792, a republic was declared and everyone made citizen, irrespective of income, religion, or even race at first, although that did not include those who were enslaved, nor did it include those who were in fact women. So what we have to think about is the ways in which the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen and its fundamental principles acted both as an orientation, a dream, a promise, and a promise that was not always followed. One especially momentous event was the slave uprising, or rather the slave uprising that became a slave revolution that erupted in 1791 in Saint-Domingue, one of France's richest and most brutal slaves colony, which ultimately led to the abolition of slavery from the French government. So the French Revolution was a unique, foundational, and unforeseen event. And in 5 years, the shape of French society had been transformed and shaped for decades to come. And some of these developments are still those that exist to this day. So what did the revolution achieve? It eliminated corporate privileges. It gave equal rights to all adult men citizens, although, as you know, that always needs to be qualified. It established a strong central government, still a hallmark of French society. It strengthened the position of property-owning bourgeoisie, redefined gender division between men and women. It made France the first European country to abolish slavery in its colonies. It established a secular society and created a formidable military machine through mass conscription. And it recreated cultural practices, establishing the metric system, for instance, or a different calendar. But with the fall of Robespierre, the radical Republican leader, the resurfacing of the forces of resistance and the trend towards order and consensus meant that the Republic became a bourgeois republic until the coming to power of a popular Corsican general, Napoleon Bonaparte, in 1799. Now, Napoleon, as he is known, started his career as a general with very successful military campaigns, as you will read. And he was also widely represented. And on the left to your screen, you should see an image of Napoleon on horseback crossing the Alps. And notice how the cape and the horse show the direction of the wind. And in fact, he is here leading the men that you see in the background, showing heroically, gloriously the way to victory and to a new era. This was painted by Jacques-Louis David, who had painted the tennis court Oath, and who will also become the official painter for Napoleon. So it shows Napoleon crossing the Alps with the army in 1800. But this was about the making of a myth. In practice, he crossed the Alps on the back of a donkey. So when he came to power as a general representing the forces of youth and renewal, he embodied much of what other Europeans celebrated, so much so that Beethoven, the composer, whose piece you may have listened to, created in 1804 a piece called Eroica that was dedicated to Napoleon. And he tore up the dedication when he learned in 1804 that Napoleon had named himself emperor. So Napoleon changed France and Europe radically. What did he achieve? So in order to think about what he achieved, I'd like to think about how he preserved the legacy of the French Revolution and how he undid the legacy of the French Revolution. If we think of the legacy of the French Revolution, he himself represents what the French Revolution supported, that is, valuing merit over privilege, merit over birth. He was himself a military talent who did not come from a noble family and had risen to a position of power. He also continued the practice of conscription from military campaigns. He established a new social hierarchy not based on nobility and privileges through the Legion of Honor, the recognition of merit. He promoted education and the sciences, in fact, celebrating the modernization in France, and he established the Civil Code, which I'll return to in a minute. But at the same time, he also undid much of the French Revolution. He participated in the 1799 coup, which truly and finally ended the revolution. And Napoleon believed power should be concentrated in the hands of one man. And that is what he became first as consul and later emperor. And that means that once in power, he abolished parliamentary elections. He discredited the constitution, which he thought should be short and obscure, and drafted a new one that did not allow direct elections and eliminated the Declaration of Rights, which was usually embedded in it as a preamble. He limited political expression, establishing censorship, especially for the political press. He also reconciled with the Catholic Church. He repressed workers who soon had no rights and no protection. And the Civil Code, which he enacted, was profoundly patriarchal, essentially relegating women who'd been given civil and political rights under the Republic, notably the right to divorce and a number of other rights, in fact, relegated them to second-class citizen, with now being quasi-children in the eyes of the law. And the Civil Code remained in effect in France until 1965. He also re-established slavery. So to summarize, from 1789 until his coronation as emperor in 1804, Bonaparte exercised personal power within the framework of republican institutions. Now, at first, he was backed by genuine popular support and oversaw the creation of an efficient administrative machine. He ended the conflict with the Catholic Church, in fact, recognizing Catholicism as the religion of a majority of French people, and compelled the signature of peace with European country, notably Britain in 1802. But this came with the abandonment of republican and revolutionary principles, undoing the promise and the practice of equality in all kinds of ways, and especially for those that we've discussed, women and those who had been enslaved. So in 1804, Napoleon finally decided to abandon the republican facade of the consulate and crown himself emperor, making his power hereditary, returning to the monarchical principle of one-man rule. And here you have it depicted in the very famous coronation of Napoleon and Josephine, the painting that Beyonce and dancers are seen repeatedly dancing in front of in their video. So his rule as emperor, would launch another series of European wars as he tried to create a European-wide empire. And it did not end until his military defeat in 1814. So he left a profound mark on France. And in fact, that mark is not just political or just in the law. It is very physical and in the monument and in the spaces of Paris. Monuments that are there because Napoleon brought them there or had them built. The most famous example being the Arc de Triomphe, the Arch of Triumph at the top of the Champs-Élysées. One of the most famous monuments in Paris, commissioned in 1806 after the victory at Austerlitz by Napoleon. In fact, laying the foundations took 2 years, and it was not finished until 1810 and not fully completed until 1833 and 1835. And it towers much of France as one of its preeminent monuments. And this, using neoclassical references that you can see also in David's paintings, was in fact, one might argue, quite lucky, because these are some of the plans, pre-revolutionary plans that had been put forth, for instance, to celebrate his Egyptian military campaigns, building an elephant at the center of Paris as a testament to this. Now, of course, thankfully, these were abandoned. But he also radically changed the shape of Europe. And that will be a question you need to answer on the quiz. Now, his defeat following the campaign in Russia in 1812 meant that ultimately Napoleon abdicated on April 6, 1814. And in 1815, he went into exile. This led to the 1815 Congress of Vienna, which was extremely crucial as a way of rearranging European political power. And I will leave you to see its definition and explanation in the textbook. So in conclusion, the early 19th century, that is the early 1800s, is a world haunted by the turmoils, the wars, and the violence unleashed in the last 30 years. The turmoil of almost 5 years of revolution in France, and France being embroiled in ongoing wars. Wars to defend the French Republic in the face of European monarchies trying to destroy it, and the even more destructive wars unleashed by Napoleon as an attempt to conquer Europe. But the violence of the slave revolutions, which led to the historic abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue and the creation of the Black Republic of Haiti in 1804. And this is the context in which we can understand and see and witness the emergence of new political ideologies, new artistic movements, and new intellectual ideas. That is why it's important to keep in mind that these new ideologies, artistic movements, and ideas were influenced by slavery and imperialism as an idea and an event. And indeed, those haunted the European imagination, first and foremost as an incredible, unexpected and unforeseen event that had taken place in 1791. And this meant that for many, in fact, Toussaint Louverture became an icon and a hero, a revolutionary hero, especially celebrated by the Romantics, such as here, Wordsworth, who wrote a poem dedicated to Toussaint Louverture. But slavery also infused the metropolitan imagination as an idea and continued to be the privileged metaphor, as it had been since the 18th century, to discuss and think about relations between fellow citizens, individuals, and the possible exclusions of this new society emerging. One famous example, of course, is Mary Wollstonecraft, a feminist radical who wrote in her very important Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792, to criticize the unfair exclusion from the domain of reason for women. And she wrote about this in the following manner. Is sugar always produced by vital blood? Is one half of the human species, like the poor African slaves, to be subjected to prejudices that brutalize them, when principles would be a surer guard only to sweeten the cup of man? Is not this indirectly to deny women reason? And here, what we have, again, is the association of slavery as the metaphor and the idea, and many of European thinkers will invoke and deploy to criticize exclusions that are constitutive of the modern age. So this event preoccupied philosophers who were trying to articulate the meaning of Saint-Domingue and the meaning of their age. One German historian wrote in 1805 that, in fact, the cause of the Haitian Revolution was the spirit of liberty. So this is the context in which Romanticism emerged, and this is what I will discuss next, and that I hope you will be able to understand as being as much as reaction to what had come before, as well as being something new. Thank you.